Well, welcome everybody to Catholic Conversations. This is Wednesday, April 29th, Feast of St. Catherine of Siena. So I'm here with Father Adam, and we're going to thank you for your questions that you submitted online. We're going to try to hit a few of those questions, but we'll also have a little bit of a dialogue between the two of us. I just wanted to start and answer all the coronavirus questions. I'm going to get all those out of the way right off the start. Just to let you know, and people have been calling and asking, we're totally at the mercy of the Archdiocese, which is at the mercy of the state. We cannot make any unilateral decisions regarding opening, regarding masses, regarding anything that the state doesn't allow at this time. The diocese is in consultation with the governor's office and trying to come up with a best case scenario. We've a plan going forward, what masses may look like in the future with smaller crowds. So we're definitely part of that conversation, and it'll definitely continue. But for right now, we can give you no dates, we can give you no times. We'll continue to persevere in what we have been doing. So just to let you know that, just to start. There have been a lot of fruits, I think, of this. You know, not fruits you go looking for, because you definitely don't want the epidemic. But what did you, Father? What do you think are some of the fruits that have come out of this that we've seen?
Well, just a couple things that I've noticed talking with some families, like more family time together. So even though they often say, like, well, you know, it's been tough in this area, that area, but they say, but we do get to spend time a lot together, and maybe in ways that they won't have another opportunity to, or maybe either if any of the parents work, now they're working from home and they have all the kids there, and even it's beautiful to see people's longing for the sacraments, even though, you know, we have to unfortunately say, like, we can't provide it or in that manner or whatever, but it's beautiful to see, like, they at least are missing it and wanting to come back. And I think that's, for me, just so edifying to see that that's something that they're being hungry for. So.
Mm-hmm. I was reading a section of St. John of the Cross. I always read St. John of the Cross in Lent. That's my Lenten discipline. But St. John of the Cross wrote about how God gives us arid times in our lives purposefully to remind us of what we long for and what we strive for. And he couched it in terms of prayer. You know, we'll have times in our lives when prayer is very arid, very desert-like, we feel it's not productive or it's beneficial. But it calls us to strive further for God when we have those periods. And I think you're right. I think the sacramental and the lack of the sacramental experience that we're in right now is causing us to long more for God. So in a way, you know, that's something to grow from.
Yeah.
One question that's come up, and I hope that you've experienced the benefits of the online live streaming celebrations, and they've really been productive too. You know, I think we've had great participation, and thank you for that. We're glad we're able to bring that to you. But the number of people that have participated in daily Mass, we know when we have a regular daily Mass celebration here in the chapel, we know how many people are here. And we're seeing double that number watching online. So great, continue that. Yeah. And I hope that is a real spiritual blessing for you. And maybe something that you continue. Father Adam and I were talking about, you know, the possibility of maintaining the live streaming daily Mass after we return to normalcy, and that would certainly be a possibility. So if it would benefit some of you, that would be great. One question that's real specific here is the one about the quote-unquote parking lot masses. You know, parking lot processions to receive the Holy Eucharist. That privilege has not been granted by the diocese. The diocese has not said we can do that. You referenced 2 Catholic churches in Colorado. I don't know what 2 they were. They may have been in a different diocese. And again, if it's Colorado Springs or Pueblo, that's not our jurisdiction and not under our bishop, so we don't know what they're saying there. But, you know, it kind of begs a little bit of the question of why we go to Mass. We go to Mass not simply to receive the Eucharist. You want to say something about that?
Yeah, I mean, strictly the obligation to go to Mass is not about receiving communion. As a matter of fact, one of the precepts of the church is that one must receive communion at least once a year during the Easter season. Now, obviously, we're in the Easter season, and that's kind of put on the wayside for now. But yeah, the importance is that we go to Mass, and of course, a fruit of that is receiving communion, but that's not the only aspect of it. The crown jewel part of it, perhaps, but and I think this is a way to help show us, again, through the unfortunate circumstance, but knowing that God can work through an unfortunate circumstance or an evil to show that the spirituality of making a spiritual communion or uniting yourself with the Mass, it's so much more than just receiving communion. You know, sometimes people I've talked to, they're like, well, why should I go to Mass when I can't receive communion for one reason or another? And you have to tell them, it's like, well, the obligation still remains. And again, it's not just simply like, well, you have to go. And I hope, as one of the fruits, I guess, going back to that, hopefully after this, that one of the fruits would be, wow, I get to go to Mass. And it's a wonderful thing that I got to do with however much frequency you did before this. And so I think this is showing the real beauty of what the Mass is. And just think about the Mass intentions that we offer for Mass. Like, that's just by the fact that the Mass is celebrated, that person's soul is receiving those graces of the Mass itself.
We as priests, we participate in an obligation to celebrate Mass, and it's for a very specific purpose. We're offering sacrifice, of course. The Mass is primarily sacrificial, but we offer that sacrifice to God. But we do it in the name of the people, and we always, when we celebrate the Mass, it's always for the people and with them in mind. And just a reminder, too, even if you're not participating physically in the Mass is ongoing. It never ceases. Throughout the world, throughout time, priests are celebrating the Mass in your name. So I want to just remind you of that. I heard of one kind of inadvertent reaction to this that I was reading. We heard about the recent Amazon Synod and all the questions and issues that came out of that. But one of the keys in that Amazon Synod was the fact that the people of the Amazon region that was being addressed in that Synod, they are deprived of Mass. You know, they'll be able to receive the sacraments once every 2 months, just on a regular basis. That's not special circumstances, that's regularly. And they say this is, in a way, what we're going through now has caused us first world people to experience third world church, you know, in a way that we can see and understand kind of the way they live and the way they worship. So, yeah, maybe it makes us a little smarter and a little more knowledgeable about some of the situations around us.
If I can just say one more thing too with that, Father Chris. I thought about that like as I put on my alb for Mass, because the alb really represents baptism. And I always feel like whenever you look at the alb, you know, under the priest chasuble, that's like his sign, the sign that he's representing us up on the altar, all of us on the altar. So all the baptized are up there with him as he's up there. And so I think it's beautiful as I put that on, I try to think about like I'm putting this on, not just because I got to get dressed for Mass, but also to represent the people that I'm going with as I, you know, offer Mass for, you know, alone or whether with the people, you know, 2 or 3 people here in the chapel and the camera, you know. So, but it's a cool experience to think about that, especially in this time.
We'll jump into some of the questions here. I hope I answered the coronavirus issue questions, but we'll start with some of the theological questions. And these are, you know, I hope you have a copy of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. It's the best resource and the best guide for you to really kind of easily look up an answer to a question, what the Church teaches. One here, the one at the bottom there, Adam, doesn't emphasis on devotion to Mary detract from worship of God? This is, practically speaking, is it possible to separate extreme devotion to Mary from adoration of Mary? It's kind of 2 questions. The first is our Catholic understanding of our devotion to Mary, and I use that word devotion. We don't worship Mary. Mary is not a goddess. That's never been taught by the Catholic Church, of course. But we know our devotion is because of her closeness to her Son, her closeness to Jesus. Nobody on the face of the earth, nobody who ever walked the face of the earth was closer to Jesus than the Blessed Mother. And as such, she knows her Son. Remember the miracle of Cana when Jesus comes forward and she simply says, you know, do what he tells you. You know, she has a trust, she has a faith in her Son. And I think when we think of prayer to Mary, people will say, well, Catholics have to pray to Mary, or they go to her first before they go to God. And that's not really true. We ask Mary to pray with us and to be a partner in our prayer, just as you'd ask a dear friend to pray for you. And I defy anybody to say they don't ask friends to pray for them. I mean, we do that all the time. Well, Mary is a friend, and she's one of our best friends. So do you want to elaborate a little more on that, just on the devotion to
Father
Mary?
Chris, he and I have talked about how we both like Dr. David Anders, who does Catholic Answers, particularly for those who are not Catholic on EWTN. And I remember him answering a question to this, and he was talking about a certain heresy in the early church. I don't remember the name, but he's like, has anybody ever heard of this? And I was like, I've never heard of this. He's like, yeah. Well, it was this sect that worshiped Mary as a goddess. And they tried to take whatever pagan background or they were whatever and trying to amplify that and apply that to Mary. And the church had to squash that. Like, no, that's going too far. I remember Pope Benedict, when this was toward the end of his papacy, I think he went to Cuba and Mexico as one of his last trips. And when he was out there, he was warning about extreme veneration to Mary, like going too far in those sorts of things. So the church does see that there sometimes can be that problem. But overall, as you were saying, Father Chris, like I always like that distinction that we're giving, like adoration belongs to God alone. Then there's the veneration to the saints that we give, and then that extra veneration we give to Mary as the queen of the saints and the angels and such. So she definitely has a special spot, but never taking the place of Jesus or God at all.
And I pay a little bit of attention to the church, the magisterium of the church, when they talk about when they kind of talk about proper devotion to Mary and define it for us. And it comes out of, again, that tradition, our understanding of Mary and her role. Just recently, within the last year, or last couple of years, the Pope decreed a feast in honor of Mary as mother of the church. Now, there's a definition of the church saying this is an aspect of Mary that we believe, that is traditional. And that goes back to the cross. That's when, in the Gospel of John, when Jesus hung on the cross and looked at Mary and said to John, behold your mother, behold your son, the essence being there that Mary is given as the mother of us all. Jesus can no longer be present in the flesh to care for us, so his mother. And so things like that, where the church really specifies something. It's a good barometer to really see kind of where the tradition of the church is understood. But see, that puts Mary in her proper role, her role as the mother to us all. So let me jump to another one. Reconciliation is always a hot topic for many people. I don't know anybody who isn't just a little bit uncomfortable going to confession. It's a time when we bare our soul, when we're honest, when we kind of make ourselves humble before God. And when we think about reconciliation, this question is good because it's something that's on the minds of a lot of people, where it says that there's no reason why a penitent might go out and commit the same sin after receiving forgiveness, thereby taking advantage of the sacrament. Well, the way that's described there is a sin in the church. We call it the sin of presumption. Presumption is sort of like saying, well, God has to forgive me, so I can do whatever I want. And I'm like a child that relies on a forgiving parent, and we never want to live our lives in a way that we are coercive of God, like God has to do this for me. Everything we receive from God is gift, it's blessing, it's grace, including, of course, the sacraments. So I don't think we want to live in that attitude that, I can go do whatever I want and then go to confession. We want to live in a more of a proper relationship with God where we avoid sin and we seek not to sin, of course, and do it out of love.
One of the stipulations is that not so much that you won't commit that sin again, but that there's at least a minimum amount of contrition that goes with the sin. And you may have heard the distinction between imperfect and perfect contrition. So it's like imperfect contrition, you're more afraid of the consequences. Let's say you're afraid of hell or whatever it may be of the sin. Whereas perfect contrition, you're just you feel more bad about offending God rather than like, he's going to punish me or whatever it may be. So it's more coming out of love. than anything else. So there does have to be a minimum degree of contrition to that. So if someone, does come to confession like, Father, I did this, and right after I'm done, I'm going to go right back to it. And, that's not really a sufficient amount of contrition that goes into that. But you can be aware that the church and the sacraments understanding that human weakness is part of this. So it's not about the weakness part that one could fall into the sin again. It's just, where is your intention in confessing this sin? And are you going to fall out of weakness, or are you just going to fall out of maliciousness, where you're like, well, I'm forgiven, I'm going to go right ahead and do it again, and because you got away scot-free. So there's a different kind of attitude that you bring to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's see. This is a good one, and I want to commend the 7-year-old girl who submitted this question, because it is a good one.
Yeah,
the one at the top of the second page. If we are to love our enemies, which is what Jesus, of course, taught us, if we're to love our enemies, to pray for them and not hate them, then how does that mean that we should not hate Satan? Should we pray for him? I appreciate the motivation of the question, because it's well motivated. It's coming out of I really want to do what Jesus taught us to do. Satan's kind of a different topic and a different area. If you look at Satan, he made his choice out of free will. He made his choice to betray God. He suffers the consequences of that choice. And the church has always kind of seen Satan as punished, and I hate to use the word, but he's irredeemable. It's like, so prayer for him is futile. He is judged, if you want to use that word. Do you have anything more?
Yeah,
specific
the way
there?
that the church understands, remember that Satan is an angel. And so an angel has a far superior intellect than we do. And so an angel, unlike what we can do, can always see all the consequences of his action. And so that's why it is irredeemable, because remember what Jesus said on the cross as he was being nailed on the cross, that, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And Fulton Sheen, in his great bravado would say, it was ignorance that saved the day on that case. But there is no forgive Satan, for he did not know what he was doing. He knew exactly what he was doing, and yet he made the choice. And so that's why it may seem, we don't want to throw the word irredeemable, but at the same time, it's like Satan knew all the infinite consequences of his actions that would come about, whereas we don't. And so that's why there is this process of conversion and, sacrament of confession and so on. So we just have to understand that he knew exactly what he was doing when he made the choice.
And when we do pray for the dead, as we do at Mass, and we pray for our loved ones, we pray for their conversion, even in purgatory. But Satan isn't converting. That isn't of his interest. He knows what he's done. He knows the consequences. So we can't really pray for his conversion, because, again, it's kind of futility. Mm-hmm. Now, the second part of this, we definitely hate what he does, but do we hate him? 7-year-old girl that answers this question, I remember when I was in Catholic school, I was probably about your age, about 7, 8 years old. I remember Sister Cecilia in 2nd grade telling us that we don't even hate Satan, the devil, but we hate the things he does. And I thought, how many years later I can still quote Sister Cecilia there, but I think what you're asking about that is, should we hate him, or should we hate what he does, but do we hate him? And I would say, well, I think you're on the right track there too. Of course we hate his actions, which in a way continue in the world, but do we hate him? Well, no, I don't think you want to harbor any hate anywhere, in any way. Let's go to the next question. This is one about sort of the end times. We read, the end of the world. We understand that Jesus will come to judge the living and the dead. We recite that in the creed that we recite every time we celebrate Mass. Will the world be destroyed by fire? Will those already dead be judged again? What is the resurrection of the body? Cremation? So you're taking a thought and then running with 7 different questions out of that, but that's okay. As far as the issue of judgment, there are 2 levels of judgment. The first is upon the point of death, the person is judged immediately. The body and soul are separated, of course. The soul is eternal. The body dies to this world. There will be a particular judgment where each person will be judged individually. No one will escape particular judgment, that personal judgment. So will the dead be judged again? Yes. They're already judged, but they will also be judged again at the end times when Jesus will come to judge the living and the dead. Are we getting close to the end of the world? I don't know. Jesus himself said he doesn't know the time. He said only the
Well,
Father.
he's getting closer.
Well,
I don't know
for each day, I assume we get closer, if you want to say it that way. But Jesus himself even said only the Father in heaven knows the time and date. So we have to trust that. Do you want to say anything more a little bit about that area?
Well, I think just to make a point too, that when Father Chris says that there will be a second judgment, doesn't mean like the first judgment, oh, you're going to heaven, oh, the second judgment, you're going to hell.
Correct.
Like, I mean, you're going one direction, but yeah, the way that it's described is like the particular judgment and the general judgment. Mm-hmm. And I never really thought about the difference between the two until I heard Father Mitch Pacwa on EWTN, and he was talking about with the general judgment, whereas the particular judgment is like your life, what you did, where you're at the point of death, and so on and so forth. But the general judgment is more like looking at all the consequences of your action. Like see all the ways that your one action, the way, you maybe flipped someone off on the road, and like what kind of chain reaction that caused. And for all of our actions and all the people that may have hurt or whatever. So it's very interesting to think that that's something that will, and of course I think that's even tied up with the resurrection of the body. Like, as Father Chris said, you're separated body and soul, but at that moment, there will be a resurrection of the body together with that.
The second area of this same question by this same writer is the issue of cremation and cremains and things like that. Just a reminder, I know I've written this in the bulletin a couple of times. The year 1962 is the year the church took the stigma of mortal sin on cremation off. So ever since 1962, there's been no mortal sin attached to the action of cremation. So that's 60 years ago the church changed that. Cremation is still not the proper best choice of the church. It may be for your family for a variety of reasons, but the church still recommends strongly full body burial. We know with regard to the second coming and the rising of the dead that is more the proper way. But the church certainly understands pastorally the issue of cremation. As far as the celebration of the mass, like a funeral mass goes, there are some slight differences between a mass with a coffin, with a full body versus cremains. They're probably subtle enough that you don't notice the difference, but the prayers are slightly different. How things like holy water used, the beginning of the celebration is changed because the body's not presented at the door of the church. So there's some slight changes, but the church has adapted to these areas. One of the things, though, it's not so much whether cremation's allowed. The big question becomes, what do you do afterwards? And this comes up a lot. Of course, the church does not condone any way, shape, or form the strewing or scattering of ashes. We say, take it to the other extreme. Would you throw a dead body in a field? I mean, would you do that? It's the same thing. It's a body. It doesn't matter what form it's in. So we really do not condone that. The people will say things like, I've got my husband's ashes at home and we're going to scatter them over. Like, can you come to the house and bless the urn? We're like, no, we can't, because we cannot condone the practice. So we can't do that. Or I've had the situation where a lady cremated her husband and then buried him on her property. And she wanted me to come and bless the grave. And I told her, well, no, I can't really do that either. So we don't want to play semantics here or anything. We want to be very careful and understand what the church is really calling for. So they put in here, and it's interesting because they say, what about burial at sea? Burial at sea is that. Burial at sea is burial. It is proper. It is perfectly allowed by the church because it's in a sealed container. The ashes are not strewn on the lake shore or on the lake surface. They are buried at sea. So that practice has always been allowed by the church because of situations in older times when people would die on shipboard and they couldn't keep the body on the ship and they'd have to bury it at sea. So that was allowed. If you remember, John Kennedy was buried at sea very publicly. It was carried on the news. But again, in a sealed container and in a proper way. So that is allowed.
What would you say to about keeping ashes instead of distributing?
Yeah, that's also not recommended by the church. Burial is proper. It is what we do. The funeral liturgy of the church is in 3 parts, and you can observe all 3 parts, or any combination thereof. The first is the vigil, often held the night before, which may include the rosary as part of the celebration. Prayers where the people gather in the presence of the family and sometimes the body of the loved one, and we offer the vigil, then the funeral mass itself, and then the third is the burial. The graveside service, as we call it, is the third part of the ritual. So burial is proper and should be the proper response from the funeral mass.
It's actually one of the corporal works of mercy. 7 corporal works of mercy is to bury
Correct,
the dead.
burying the dead.
Yeah. So.
This first question, the one on the first page, it's interesting. It's getting a little into, is it Thomas Aquinas?
Which one? Mine is arranged a little bit. Is about the scripture one?
The one from Courtney. The one where she says, the only knowledge the only knowledge humanity has about heaven is negative knowledge.
Oh, yes.
Isn't that Thomas Aquinas, Via Negativa, and
yes.
all that stuff?
You've
been in seminary more recently.
Actually, I talked about, I was on with Chrissy yesterday, and I was talking about how someone asked, how this person asked this question, and this is the question I was telling you earlier, this is such a weird, interesting question, but we technically, okay, so let me just read out the question just so you know. I remember once being taught in a college class of Catholicism that the only knowledge humanity has about heaven is negative knowledge, meaning that we know what heaven is not, but we don't really know what heaven is exactly. I was wondering if this is indeed accurate, and if not, what is the Catholic teaching on heaven, so on and so forth. So basically, we can only say what heaven is not rather than what heaven is. Now, I've never really, in more common arguments, this is more applied to God, I guess, if you want to look at that. We can only say what God is not rather than what God is. This is technically called in theology, I do remember this, called apophatic theology. So you're only speaking in a negative way. So you can't say God is good. All you can say is God is not evil. And it sounds kind of silly to us, but the reason why that was sort of the emphasis is to show that God is so beyond us, God is so above us that we can't say anything about God that way. So all we can say is what he's not. And this is true, and my teacher always emphasizes, there's always a greater dissimilarity than a similarity between us and God, right? And that runs true. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that all we can speak about are negatives regarding God. God is not evil, God is not temporal, God is not, whatever. You can Via Negativa and whatever, and not to say that those aren't true, but that's not the only way. So yeah, Aquinas actually talk about the attributes of God, God's goodness, God's existence, and so on and so forth. So these are positive attributes that are not simply not negations, but negative way of speaking. But so yeah, it's a very, very interesting, because there has been a lot of pushback in medieval theology about the Via Negativa. We can only speak about God in a negative way, and so maybe you learned a little bit of apophatic theology at that time. So that's very interesting.
I would, Courtney, who asked this question, I'd encourage you to go to college and major in philosophy.
Yeah.
You're already halfway there.
Yes, and read, what is it, question 3 of the Summa 4 or something like that. But
the top question, we only got one kind of scriptural question. I was teasing Father Adam before we started. I said if this was a Protestant group, we'd have all scriptural questions. But we Catholics, we're maybe we know Scripture really well. We do it Spirit of Christ here. But since Christ loved his mother so much, which we know is true, do you think he could have visited her before the tomb was discovered empty on Sunday? I'll let you answer this one. That's an interesting question.
Well, there is a tradition that Jesus did appear to Mary, his mother Mary, very first thing. Another thing I heard, because we don't have I don't know if there's a solid tradition about that. I guess for me, I kind of like thinking of Mary Magdalene as the first to see Jesus, but you know. But I've heard someone make an interesting connection between Mary, the mother Mary, not visiting the tomb, no account of her visiting the tomb, and the finding of Jesus in the temple. And what they say is that when she was frantically looking for the 12-year-old Jesus who had ran away from the caravan, not ran away from the caravan, he just stayed back, but they were frantically looking for him, and when they found him, she's like, didn't you know we were frantically looking for you? And Jesus, of course, said to her, did you not know that I had to be about my Father's business? And as she pondered all these things in her heart. And so I saw someone making a connection that Mary didn't need to look for the tomb because she believed already. She knew that Jesus was going to resurrect. So in a sense, the fact that we don't have an account of her going to the tomb almost testifies to the fact that she knew he was going to rise from the dead. I just thought that was interesting food for thought. So.
You know, it begs the question as well. A question that comes up periodically is, people that are people that pray the rosary regularly know the Apostles' Creed. We don't use the Apostles' Creed at Mass normally, but the line about Jesus descended into hell or he descended to the dead, people will ask what that means. And the way that's been kind of interpreted by the church over the years is that during that period between Jesus' death on the cross and his resurrection, that Jesus entered hell as a word for the netherworld, you know, because if you think about it, you know, Jesus died on the cross for our salvation, for our redemption. So all those people that died before Christ were not redeemed. They were in a place that God prepared for them, but they were not redeemed and didn't experience the fullness of heaven. So it's believed that, you know, Jesus went there and redeemed, gave those souls the grace of sort of retro redemption to allow them to be redeemed. And generally it's pointed out very strongly, like St. Joseph, St. John the Baptist, the patriarchs, the prophets, you know, those great figures that were not Christian figures, were not beneficiaries of Christ's resurrection at the time. So it kind of fits into that as well, that, you know, God's plan is to really take care of all souls, you know, and where Jesus fits in, you know, we see that there too.
I like that aspect of like retroactive redemption. Yeah. Like I think it was Pius IX that would declare the Immaculate Conception, the papal document Ineffabilis Deus, and he basically says that in anticipation of Christ's redemptive act, because, you know, we're like, well, didn't Mary need Jesus as a savior? And she did. Remember when us priests, we pray the Liturgy of the Hours, we always say, and my spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. And so when we talk about the Immaculate Conception, that she was immaculately conceived from sin, you know, at the moment of her conception, she was saved retroactively by Christ's redemption, not chronologically, but in a sort of mysterious way that she had been given sort of special access to it before it chronologically went about in history. So.
We have a couple of liturgical questions. I'll address those, or we'll bring those up. Just a little bit of a definition of liturgy. Liturgy is a word. It's a Greek word that means work, and it's usually defined as the work of the people. It's the work we do in offering praise to God. It's usually, people think liturgy, they think of the Mass, but you know, each of the sacraments have its own liturgy, its own form, its own verbiage, the words used. So the liturgy is really a gift of the people to God in sacrifice and in praise. So liturgy is fluid. It changes over time. Of course, we don't say Mass in Latin anymore. There's a good example. It also is specific sometimes to areas. Different parts of the world will celebrate the Mass in different ways. The Church gives some kind of broad definitions of liturgy, but leaves it up to, in subsidiary, leaves it up to more general local custom or tradition in a way. That can even extend down to a parish level in some ways. Let me give you an example. One of the liturgical guidelines that the Church, and when I say the Church, I mean, you know, the universal Church. One of the guidelines it says is that it's up to the individual bishops' conferences. So the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops would make liturgical recommendations, decisions for the United States, to determine what is the proper way we receive communion. There's an example. And the USCCB has said that what we do is we come forward in a line to receive communion, in procession, standing predominantly. And you think back to when some of you were young and you received at a communion rail kneeling. Well, that's not the present recommendation of the USCCB. Of course, there are options in the reception of communion. We can receive on the tongue, we can receive in the hand. There are different ways of doing that. If you remember back just a few years ago, 10 years ago maybe, the Vatican or the USCCB recommended the slight bow before you receive communion. That was an effort to kind of come up with a general posture of the faithful in receiving communion, to kind of tie us together and to unite us, and to also answer a lot of questions about a lot of things that were going on all over the place. So that's an example of liturgy. So it's handled on a kind of an advisory level at the top, and then kind of legislated, that's not the right word, but legislated at the lower level. So let me just share with you two questions we have. One is about the Our Father. I'll do that one first. People always ask me about, holding hands at the Our Father, and I always say that is not a precept of the church. It is not in any liturgical books or liturgical guidelines. The church does not call for holding hands during the Our Father. What happened there is that erupted spontaneously from the people, probably about 1974, I would say. I mean, it came out of the Vatican Council. It's very strong in some parishes, and some parishes it's not, but it is definitely not required. And I know now when I say liturgical guidelines can be interpreted, liturgical guidelines given to Father Adam and I when we celebrate Mass are carved in stone. We have to follow the teachings of the Church and the general instruction of the Missal. But we are not instructed to ever tell the people to hold hands. That's not part of the Mass. It's not lines that we have at Mass. So we don't do that. And as priests, we are not also to participate in the holding of hands. We're not to hold the hands with other ministers. So if you watch us at Mass, that's what we do, because that's what we're called to do. The rubrics of the Missal, the words in red, you read the black and do the red, call us to pray in a certain way, and that's what we do. Now, as far as you folks out there in the pews, we certainly don't discourage you from holding hands. It's part of the tradition of the American church. I'm sure you go to other countries and they will look at you like you have four heads if you want to hold their hand at the Our Father, because they don't do it. It's not their tradition. Or even other parishes or other parts of the country may have that tradition as well. So just know that if it happens spontaneously, and it's the action of the people. And if it's done in the right spirit, it's of God. What can be wrong about it? I don't know if you want to add anything there.
Yeah, and again, I think with anything, they when we talk about the liturgy, and like when you read a lot of documents and stuff, they talk about a certain sobriety that should go with the celebration of a liturgy, and so not to be extravagant or to be underwhelming, but the certain, as they call it, a noble simplicity. So it should be not too ornamental, but noble, done very nobly. And this is actually a topic that really interests me, because I incidentally did my thesis topic in seminary about the celebration of Mass and regarding like certain gestures, and not necessarily gestures individually, but just the fact of using our body in worship and stuff. So I think there's a certain conscientiousness we should bring. So it isn't just simply, okay, let's hold hands, everybody, but in what ways am I using my body? In what ways are we using material things in worship in a very conscientious way? St. Paul in the letter to the Romans talks about spiritual worship, latreia logogikon, like a logical worship. It isn't just kind of, no disrespect, but not like a Pentecostal power hour or something where like people are just jumping around going crazy and doing things. There's something logical about what we do. And so there's an order and a logic of what we do. And so I think it's good for us to reflect as priests and laity and such, like when we do certain gestures at a Mass, whether it's traditional or whether it's the bishop's guidelines or whatever, it's like, why do I do what we're doing? And things. I think it's just beautiful to reflect on the fact that we get to use our bodies in worship. Maybe something we take for granted, but it isn't just like just meditation, just purely spiritual, but it engages the body a little. And I like when people talk about Catholic aerobics, the kneeling, standing, sitting, whatever, and stuff like that. So it's interesting to reflect about, just to make us more conscientious about what we're doing.
And just be assured, in the liturgy, our goal in the Catholic aerobics or Catholic calisthenics is not to confound you or to confound people that don't know, but posture is prayer. Mm-hmm. And think about it. What are the three postures we use at Mass? Standing, sitting, and kneeling. Mm-hmm. Sitting is a receptive posture. When we're sitting, we're receiving, so we're listening to the Word of God. And think about, you sit during the readings. We stand to proclaim, to say something, to sing. So, musicians, I don't want to quote Miles here, but musicians will say it's wrong to sit and sing. You should always stand and sing. Yeah. Real true musicians say, because it's a proclamation. And then kneeling is, of course, a very humble posture. It's the word of debasement. It puts us, we're not God, so we put ourselves in humble prayer before God. And it's supplication. We're praying for something. So we kneel in prayer during the consecration, during the Eucharistic prayer, because we're joining our prayer for that action with the priest to be able to come to pass. So posture is really important. Mm-hmm. And I would just encourage you, as far as the holding hands, if you don't want to, please feel free. You don't have to. And if you are a person who loves to hold hands, don't get mad at the person next to you who doesn't want to hold your hand. After we've gone through the coronavirus pandemic, we may never hold hands again.
It's not an issue at all.
But that may answer the question right there. Yeah. The other question regards the ringing of bells during Mass. This is another kind of a traditional question, and I hope that many of you know where that came from. And if you don't, you shouldn't ask this question. But the handbells came into the liturgical use, I believe, in not the Middle Ages, more the Renaissance era, or probably actually does go back to the Middle Ages. And it was a liturgical response to the people of the time. Think of the Middle Ages. 90% of the people were illiterate, could not read or write. They did not know Latin, because Latin was not a spoken language of the world at that time. Mm-hmm. So they'd go to Mass and they'd kneel, they'd sit, they'd stand, they'd pray their rosary. They wouldn't really participate because they couldn't. They didn't understand the words. They saw the actions and they knew what was going on. But the ringing of the bells occurred at the time of the consecration as an alarm clock, as a wake-up, to tell the people who really weren't following the words of the Mass, but to know when the consecration occurred so they could focus. They could come out of their rosary and look and pray. That's where the bells came from. And liturgy always has a practical purpose. So much of the aspects of our liturgical action are practical. They have a reason why they're there. And this is one of them. They persisted for many, many years, and then they kind of took on a more spiritual quality. They lost that as people became literate, and then eventually when the Mass passed out of Latin into local languages, the use of the bells was less necessary, of course, for the original reason. But it became, it's what liturgists refer to as a barnacle. A barnacle is that thing that sticks to the bottom of the ship that you have to scrape off every once in a while. You don't go looking for it, but it just attaches, and no one quite knows where it comes from. Bells are one of those things, but they're certainly acceptable and they're fine. And if they help you in your prayer, terrific. The reason we don't use them at Spirit of Christ is because Spirit of Christ has not ever used them since 1974 when the church was built. It's not part of our tradition. And I'm not going to add something, or we're not going to add something to our liturgy. It's not called for. So that's the answer. But I think you can, in your mind, you know that time of the consecration when that occurs. So that's the answer on bells. And there's other aspects of things that you might go to other churches and see things slightly different. But I don't really, as a pastor or priest, I don't really have a right to add something to the liturgy that's not called for in the liturgy. So that's just my own interpretation or my own call. The last thing I think we'll talk about is kind of at the bottom of page 2, where, I'm sorry, I was thinking about the one. No, it's the one at the bottom of page 1. I'm sorry.
What is it about?
Where someone asks about discernment, and that's
yeah.
a real good area. Discernment is a word you probably hear, in the media or on Catholic media. It's used a lot. People use it in their personal spirituality. Discernment is always trying to understand the will of God, to do it in a variety of ways. We discern the will of God for the church, for the world, but we also discern the will of God in our own lives. And some that's ongoing. It's not like all the questions are answered all at once. And one area of discernment is the discernment of a vocation. Now, that can express itself in a religious vocation, but it can also express itself in a vocation to marriage, a vocation to family life, a vocation to career or what you do in ministry. So we're always discerning. Everybody is. Discernment is listening for the will of God. The important thing to remember, and I'll let you say a few words here too about this, but the thing I remember when I first started in seminary was my spiritual director was very clear to me that, it's not you wanting to be a priest. It's God wanting you to be a priest, and then you answering the invitation. Mm-hmm. So it's a way of sort of not us asserting our will, like my will is that I become a priest. That wasn't the proper attitude at the time I was going through vocational discernment, but it was opening oneself to the will of God. And
true, yeah. And it's not about what do I necessarily want to be, and not say that doesn't play a factor, but what is God intending me? And I've heard people, I don't know if this is true, this is just kind of what's stuck in my mind, is like, what if you choose the wrong vocation or whatever, but it's like, but either way, God is going to work through that, whether that's true or not. But what I loved about, and perhaps you got this too when you're in seminary formation, was that there's several steps in our formation in seminary, and the first major thing we do is make our call to candidacy. And the way that they explained it to us was that before candidacy, which I received my 4th year of seminary, before candidacy, you're sort of like an inquirer. Sort of like testing the waters, okay, because this is right. I think God has called me to be a priest. Okay, so I'm going to live at a seminary, be in formation, learn from other priests, learn philosophy and theology or whatever. But you're still kind of testing the waters. Whereas candidacy is, the church has now listened and seen your life and listened to you. And so they're sort of like saying, okay, I think I believe this guy. And they pull you in. And so it gives a greater sense of conviction. So I remember telling myself, I'm going to be a priest. Now, I'm not saying that out of presumption, but I'm saying that out of my own intention. I'm not just, because I was always well, God could be calling me, God may not be calling. Well, at that moment, it's no, I'm studying to be a priest. Whether that actually happens, it's still to be seen, but this is what I'm really studying for, and so on. So as you go further, you just build more and more confidence in what you're doing until you, especially ordained as a deacon, which, by the way, was your anniversary yesterday. Happy anniversary. 30 years, you said?
30.
30 years since you're a diacon. Wow. So it's until that big day. But that's the beauty of the seminary environment. It's there to not give you a vocation, but to foster your discernment. And so all of us are called to, first and foremost, all of us are called to holiness. Nobody's accepted from that. And then we have to discern in what way am I to live out that call to holiness, whether that's a priest or husband, wife, religious, and whatever. So,
mentioning the seminary, that word seminary comes from the Latin word seeds. A seminary is literally a greenhouse, is the image. It's a place like a hothouse of the seeds that are growing and nurturing. And I remember, when I was in seminary and came to the point of call to candidacy, which was about the same point. And that's felt at the time like an enormous hurdle. Yeah. It's, you received a letter from, I believe, from the bishop, calling you to candidacy. In other words, the church sort of affirming your vocational discernment journey and saying, like Father Adam said, we've listened to this guy, we've seen his level of commitment, and we think he's a good candidate, and we think he's on the right track. So that call to candidacy, I remember us all sitting there and sweating. Are we going to get the letter? Who's not going to get the letter? That kind of thing. And then we had a ceremony of some sort where, we kind of affirmed that. For me, it was sort of a turning, because it's like, okay, I'm at the crossroads of discernment where I'm no longer kind of looking to the world, but I'm looking this direction. And it sort of set the focus toward priesthood. So that was a very crucial time. The ordinations to the diaconate and the priesthood were great celebrations, but I remember that call to candidacy being gut-wrenching at the time, because it was sort of a no turning back kind of a moment. But everything we had done in seminary up to that point had led us to that. I remember after I was ordained a priest, I went and met with my spiritual director, the first meeting I had after my ordination. A dear man who's still a very good friend, and he looked at me and he said, "Well, Chris," he said, "now let's talk about you answering the call to vocation each day." And I was like, no, you don't understand. I've checked that box. I've gone through that process. I'm done with vocation and discernment. And he said, no, because you affirm your vocation each and every day. But married couples, don't you make a commitment to be married and to love this person each and every day? It's not, you don't answer the question and then move on. No, it's an ongoing thing. And that's what discernment really is. It's that continual seeking God's will and then answering it, having the real conviction and courage to answer that. That's I believe, what we're kind of lacking today, is that courage and that conviction to really be able to answer that call, because that call's out there. God never quits calling people, but having the courage to answer it. I think we're at the end of our hour. Thank you very much. We'll probably hope to bring a couple more of these for you, as long as we're still cooped up and locked up. But just be assured, Father Adam and I are continuing to pray for you and to keep you in our thoughts. We miss you a lot. Mass is not the same. It's really hard saying Mass to an empty church. Hard preaching to an empty church, isn't it? You're like, where do I look? Who do I look at? Where do I focus? But luckily we have the camera to look at. I just want to make one commercial. This is Wednesday, April 30th. Is it the 30th? No, 29th. I keep getting wrong. It's Feast of Catherine of Siena. Feast of St. Catherine of Siena today. On Friday, May 1st, we're doing a very special event. The Bishops of America, the USCCB, have called for a renewal of the consecration of the United States to the Blessed Virgin Mary. The United States has already been consecrated to the Blessed Mother. That was done many years ago. She is the patroness of our country. But during this time of difficulty, the bishops have called for this prayer for us to reconsecrate ourselves to her. So we will be celebrating that with the American Church. It will take place on Friday, May 1st, 3 o'clock Eastern Time. So that's 1 o'clock our time. We will celebrate a ceremony here, a prayer of music, of readings from Scripture. Father Adam and I will both participate. We are trying to send out to you the prayers so you can have them at home. And if you watch at 1 o'clock on Friday, it'll be live streamed here from the chapel. You can participate at home in this consecration to the Blessed Mother. So it'd be a great time for us all to pray together with a common purpose and for a common goal.